Hello and greetings. This is Train Time, the podcast, and it really is train time, even here in the United States. I'm Karen Christensen, and I started the Train Campaign, a project of the Barrington Institute, in 2011. I began recording interviews with politicians and train activists in 2017, most in the U.S., but sometimes looking to projects in other parts of the world. I hope you'll subscribe to Train Time and also send me your questions and suggestions. And visit our YouTube channel, Train Campaign, for some great interviews and amazing historical footage. Hi, I'm Karen Christensen. We're at Train Time now, and I'm talking today to Matt Silber, who has been working with me, came to me because of his interest in trains and some ideas he had. And so, first of all, I'd like to learn a little bit more about Matt and introduce you to our audience here at Train Time. So tell us about yourself and what brought you. Why did you end up writing to me in the first place?
Great question. Thanks for having me on, Karen. This is exciting. First podcast I've ever done. Well, so it's a long story, and I was like, you sent me in the email, talk a little bit about your background and what got you interested. And the short version, I guess, of the story is the last couple of years, I've been living in a couple different places. I lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut, in the Black Rock section. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, in Connecticut. And then I lived in New York City for a while after having grown up, in a pretty standard suburban sort of neighborhood, very car dependent, single family homes, things like that. And living in different environments really just kind of opened my eyes to the opportunities that are afforded to non-automobile transportation and got me thinking a little bit about it. And I think I was also already kind of primed to try to figure out more about, transportation and public utilities and stuff like that, because my father for decades served as a member of the Planning and Zoning Commission in my
What's your
hometown.
hometown?
Trumbull, Connecticut. hmm And he's been there for a long time, since like 2000, since I was in high school. And I guess like a funny way to start the story is I remember being like a teenager and my dad, when he was first elected to the Planning and Zoning Commission, whatever, of Trumbull. And he was saying, like, oh, Matt, I was a high school student. And he was like, Matt, it is so important, you decide what goes where and who gets to build what. And it's very, very important. And I remember being a high school student being like, yeah, sure. Like, okay, that's boring.
Right.
But, yeah, no kidding. But but now that I've gotten older, I've gotten so interested in land use and accessibility. So long story short, basically, when I would come back home to my parents' house in Trumbull, after having lived in Black Rock, which is a very walkable area, very close to the Metro North New Haven line, after having lived in New York City for a while with access to the subway and buses and just being able to walk and access my daily needs that way, coming home to my hometown was very eye-opening to how inaccessible things could be and things were. And it started getting the ball rolling a little bit that way. And then I talked to a friend of mine, Paul Knight, who is a city planner, architectural planner. We're just friends. Actually, our wives are friends. We're friends now, but he's a great guy. We spend weekends together. So I asked him, like, hey, like, I've been getting interested in, land use, transportation, just kind of as a hobby. Like, do you have any recommendations for some light reading I can share with my dad? He's on the Planning and Zoning Commission, maybe something that can kind of open his eyes to, accessibility, walkability, things like that. And he sent me this piece, which I don't know if I had the chance to share with you, Karen, but really for me was like an epiphany moment. It's this urban form standard. And it really just breaks down how it's very simple to design neighborhoods and public spaces that are accessible, that maximize land use, that don't require car transportation to get around. And it's so simple, and we choose not to do it when we zone for car development. And so it just makes me really passionate. And it just in general, I'm very passionate about other current issues. Right now in Connecticut, there's a housing crisis. People don't have enough homes. We obviously have a climate crisis,
Mhm.
climate emergency, carbon emissions. So all of these, I see all these things kind of dovetailing into how we plan where we live and how we get from point A to
Mhm.
point B. And so I'm just very
So
passionate about
where
it,
do you live
honestly.
now? Tell us, what's this when you can you walk out your door right now and walk to the things that you need? Walk to the shops? Yep.
Yes. Yeah, I can. And that's why we chose to
Mhm.
live here. Me and my wife moved from New York City. We live in Norwalk now, and it is, I mean, I love it because it's, and what I want people maybe who are listening, whenever I talk to people from my hometown about, like, maybe we change this zoning, maybe we change that, maybe we do some mixed use development, people get very tense and very, up in arms sometimes. And it's not, and we live in like the best of both worlds where you can have access to a car. We have a
Mhm.
car parked at our apartment unit, but we also can walk to Washington Street, where there's all these cute shops and restaurants and bars and things like that. So what I just like feel very strongly about is opportunity
Mhm.
for people to access what they want without needing a car, creating that sort of sense of community. So where I live right now, I think is
Uh-huh.
perfect. And I don't want people to think, you have to change your life or you have to live the way that I live. But I think that, you know, that sort of lends itself to opportunities for people to do things that they would like
Yeah.
to do,
I mean,
you know?
sometimes when you talk about, when anyone talks about the problem of cars, people feel as though you're saying, "I'm gonna take your car away." Instead
Right.
of,
Right.
the when I read now about people not going out and socializing and, "Oh, it's just so much, it's too much work." It's when you can walk out your door to get some milk or to get something, to go and have a beer, the lack of friction in that is just amazing. You just
Mhm.
maybe grab a coat
Yeah.
or handbag, make sure you have your wallet, and you just go. You don't have to think, "Is it gonna be a problem to park? Which way should I go? Is it
Mhm.
all those other things drop away, and I'd like people
Mhm.
to, if you once you experience it, of course, then you have that in your mind, but if you have always lived where you have to drive everywhere, it's very hard to imagine.
Mhm. And it's hard to see how it could be nice. Like, I think a lot of times people associate cars with freedom, and that's true in some sense, but it's also not true in other senses where you have the freedom to pay, a couple $100 a month for insurance and
Right.
probably a couple hundred more for car payments. And then, like you said, like, you have to think, oh, I got to walk to the car. And what I also think a lot about is how, like, when we design cities, towns, everywhere for car-centered development, it really cuts off a lot of people, and I think a lot about not just, like, young people who don't have their licenses, but I think about especially senior
Yes.
citizens, and, like, the elderly, like, I feel like one thing I care a lot about is how we treat our older people. My 2 of my grandmothers passed away in the last 5 years or so, and I think it would have really been nice for them to be able to live in a place where they can access their needs without having to drive because they weren't able to
Right.
drive after a certain
Yeah,
point.
for older people and then for kids, of course. Kids can end up
Mhm,
so isolated, and if we worry about kids
mhm.
spending too much time on their phones, it's often because there's nothing else for them, nowhere to go.
Totally. Yeah, there's, and you wonder why kids, like, they go upstairs and they play on their, computer video games all weekend, and it's like, well, all right, well, I wanna go to the movies. Well, then you
Yeah,
gotta take them, you know?
yeah,
Like, so, yeah, totally. When we talk about, like, the loneliness
yeah.
epidemic and the death of third spaces, I feel really strongly about that, and that's why I reached out to you, but I also wanted to ask
Mhm.
you a question
Yeah,
because we've been chatting
yeah.
before. What made you start the train campaign? Because I could get into my whole Maybrook line project, but I looked you up and I was like, "Oh, like, this woman seems to have had some success, like, yeah, let's
Um,
connect."
well, I came to it in different, in a very particular way, which is not through my work on community and environment, which have been part of my life for a long time. I actually started the train campaign because I'd been in China and I'd been riding high-speed trains. A lot of my work as a publisher has been in China and working with Chinese companies and publishing about China for Americans. And I'd been one spring, beautiful spring day. Took the train from Beijing to Shanghai, and then I was going to Hangzhou, which is a big tech center. It's where Alibaba and Tencent had their headquarters. Beautiful city, famous lake called West Lake, and arrived there on a perfect spring day. The thing is, I could go from Shanghai to Hangzhou in, I don't know, 40 minutes or something by high-speed train. And then go back to Shanghai the same day. And I thought, I came back to New York, and I met a friend who had come from Australia, and we were meeting, and he was going to come up here. And we got to Grand Central. We were both jet lagged, and we were walking through Grand Central, and I said, "Oh, we should have, we both need coffee because we're jet lagged." And he said, "Oh, we can get coffee on the train." And I just laughed because we were getting on Metro North. And it just kind of clicked that, if I work with people all over the place, and I thought, I'm going to Great Barrington, Massachusetts. Why shouldn't we have not necessarily Chinese style high speed trains, but why shouldn't we be
Mhm.
connected like that? For me, um,
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
why shouldn't we have, I mean, it's this thing of the best of all worlds that we could do business. I mean, one of the big challenges in a place like the Berkshires is there aren't enough well-paid jobs. There's loads of service jobs. And very hard for me as a business person to recruit the kind of people I needed to hire too, because of that sense of being remote, even though we're not that far. But it's not easy, for the kind of young people who would normally go into publishing. And
Mhm.
this train of thought coincided with a report that had been commissioned by the Housatonic Railroad Company to explore the possibility of passenger rail. So they kind of kicked this off. It'd been an idea that I'd heard around. And so this report was being launched. And that's when I thought, we should make this happen. I really knew nothing about trains. I'd lived in England for quite a long time. So I was, I'd come from the Silicon Valley. I'd never ridden a train at all until I got to England.
Yeah.
But but
Well,
yeah,
sorry to interrupt, but in Silicon Valley, they got BART. Yeah, I've written
it
that.
wasn't not when I was a
That's
kid.
cool.
The
Oh,
curious
okay.
thing though, I've realized because I'm writing about third places and walkability right now in the new book. And I realized the Cupertino I knew, even though we were about a mile from what is now Apple headquarters, it was at that point when I was a child in the early 70s, so I was, 10, 12. It was walkable. I could walk to the library. I could walk to enough stores, that we could walk to school. It's so it wasn't as bad as some suburbs I've seen. So as a child, I mean, that freedom as a child to be able to just go places that you want to go to by yourself without needing anyone to take you without asking.
To
Yeah.
take you or just like being able to be like, I'm gonna walk to the
Yeah.
bus stop and I'll take the bus
Yeah.
to the movies. I remember, not to
Yeah.
interrupt, but like asking my parents to drive me and my friends to the movies almost every weekend, and it drove them crazy. And they're like,
Yeah.
"Can't you get somebody else to do it?" And I'm sure it was nice for your parents. Just like, "All right, I'll be home for dinner. See you soon."
So we had a bit of a, can you hear me, Matt? Yeah, yeah, I
Oh
had a
yeah, I
little
can
bit
hear
of
you
a sound bit there.
a little bit.
Um, yeah, so, that was in 2011. It's a long time ago now.
Hmm.
And and so what I did was start a newsletter and have T-shirts and a blog and have T-shirts made, for the train campaign. I mean, it was so 2011.
Hmm.
But but there was a considerable effort in Canaan, Connecticut, just about that time. There. The
Mhm.
interest in Canaan there's been ebbs and flows, but there was a lot of energy in Canaan then. And a group had started using the one of the online petition forums, a petition to bring back the trains. So I started one here in Massachusetts, and we garnered between us 5,000 signatures. It was it was got a lot of attention, and they printed out things and delivered them to Hartford. So this has been going on for a long time, frustratingly.
Mhm.
And it was not
Yeah.
long after that that Deval Patrick, the then governor of Massachusetts, who really does understand and believe in the potential of rail to connect and to make new things possible, to bring opportunity to towns that are struggling. I mean, some towns struggling more
Mhm.
than others, but the dependence on tourism up here and in towns in Connecticut, Canaan, I know, is continues to suffer to because not just because of there's jobs, but the quality of jobs, the amount of money and the seasonality that tourism means is makes life
Mhm.
really difficult for people. So in Massachusetts, as we've talked about, the line is upgraded, and even further work is being done now because it was at that point, that early point, it wasn't owned by the state. They weren't going to invest
Mhm.
money in it. Where your Connecticut line, which is where our focus is now, is
Yeah.
getting that up to the same standard. And and boy, it's one of those things that's a roller coaster. And
Mhm.
and that's why I'm really glad that we can work together eh, to to bring more people in, to help people see the potential. So let's talk a little bit about Danbury and the Maybrook line, and for you to kind of sketch that out. But one thing we want to get to, and I think this will come in as quite naturally, is the
Yeah.
issue of
Yeah, of course.
misconceptions that people have, the
Mhm.
anxieties that arise. Because you were saying that when you talk about cars, people can kind of, or you talk about changing zoning, this people
Mhm.
get worried. So let's talk about your vision, and then let's
For
address
sure.
some of the concerns that we've heard.
Yeah, like, first of all, just, like, hearing how I have to admit, like, I'm very inspired by, like, you kind of it sounds like 10, 15 years ago, 2011, whatever it was, kind of came into this with the same sort of feeling that I did, was just like, "There's opportunity here, like, somebody should
Uh-huh.
do something." So that's part of why I reached out to you, and going back, as you said, to the Maybrook line. So the Berkshire line, as you said, runs from Danbury, Connecticut, up to Pittsfield, Mass. And you said the Massachusetts side has gotten the upgrades done. I've scoped out and drove along the existing line there. From Danbury up to the Massachusetts border is not up to speed. And yeah,
Yeah.
we're gonna have to work on that. But the reason I reached out to you, yes, was the Maybrook line, because if you look at a map of the Metro North New Haven line, you've got the really high functioning, the
Mhm.
Amtrak Acela runs on it from New York to New Haven. That one has got state of the art rolling stock. It's, very, very responsive for America, regular service, could set your watch
Uh-huh.
to it sort of thing. Very reliable, very highly used sort of corridor for rail. But Connecticut also has these branch
Uh-huh.
lines. You have a very small one called the Dink, I think, by
Uh-huh.
rail enthusiasts, that goes just to New Canaan. It's 20
Oh,
minutes. I
huh,
took it
huh.
last weekend. Cute little line. But what really got my attention was there's two lines that branch off of the New Haven line, the Danbury and
Uh-huh.
Waterbury line, that go to each city respectively, where the rolling stock is relatively antiquated. It doesn't have chargers. It's not updated. It's diesel. It's not electrified. It used to be electrified, but I think they
Yes.
de-electrified it
Yeah.
a couple decades ago. But anyway, so I've taken both of these because I'm a train nerd and I think it's fun, and I just wanted to explore them. And what I found was that, like, there's pretty low ridership. There's really, I mean, extremely low ridership. Like, basically, these trains serve commuters who have to go into the city from Waterbury, Wilton, Shelton, Derby, whatever it is. So you're looking at like really people who have to suffer through like a 3-hour
Yeah.
train commute. And it's not really used for anybody else, even though there's opportunity there. I mean, Danbury's a city, Waterbury's a city, and these cities, you have these branch lines that essentially terminate
Right. They
into
both go
these
just up from the New Haven line, right? Yeah.
exactly, and they're single tracked, so you basically got one train going back and forth, once
Uh-huh.
every hour. So you don't really have a lot of access. You don't really have the areas around stations are usually just parking
Mhm.
lots. There's very rarely sort of transit oriented development around it. I saw opportunity. And I was just going through some old rail maps of Connecticut and I saw that a line connected, and as you said, it's owned by the Housatonic Railroad Company called the Maybrook Line that connects the Danbury and the Waterbury line. I just had this thought like, well, what if you turn that one back on?
Right.
Right? What if all of a sudden these branch lines don't just go up and down for no reason? What if you can, be in Danbury and you can stop off here and then take it to Waterbury and you just open up accessibility to all these people instead of two lines that just go up and down, you can
It's like
connect.
Bob Yarrow, who was the president of the Regional Plan Association for years and who runs something called North Atlantic Rail. He says he says, "Think about airports. If you just plunked in one airport or two airports and the planes just went back and forth. No, that's not how it works. It's when you add lots of them. It's when it's a system and you can move all over the place. And that's how we have to think about rail.
Mhm.
It's not A to B, it's not A to B to C. It's a web. Um,
Exactly. It's one person is going from A to F and another person is going from G to C, so there's all these it's like you said, like a web, a
and when
lattice
it
work.
works well,
You know?
I one of my most recent trips to England, I thought I sometimes have rented a car, but I thought, no, I'm going to do everything by train. And there were times I was like in a little country station, pull in on one train, get off on the platform, wait a little while, and then across the platform would be another, sometimes just a single carriage. And I'd go and step on that and I'd go on my way to wherever. And it's so easy when it works. It is just a lovely way to travel.
Exactly. It's a lovely way to travel for going back to what you were talking about before with the Berkshires, which I've been to and they're beautiful. I mean, Great Barrington. We made a trip up there a couple of years ago. We saw the church from
Oh, yeah.
Alice's
Yeah,
restaurant. I
that's
don't know.
in Housatonic. Well, it's part of Great Barrington, but it's Housatonic. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a beautiful area, but from the perspective, I would think of residents of those communities, you want to increase accessibility. You want to make it easy for tourists to come. So that's kind of why I think that's part of how, you market to people who might be a little bit more hesitant to buy into trains. They're like, well, things are working okay the way that they are. It's not about, some sort of great reset conspiracy thing. This is a way to get customers into your
Yeah.
store. This is a way to get businesses up here. This is a way to get workers that, need to come in and out. And this is a way for, it's just a way for people to get around. Maybe
Right.
you'll use it. So there's so much to look forward to and so much
Yeah.
opportunity.
One of the
Yeah.
misconceptions that I hear when it comes to tourism, because in the summer we get really busy here and we have Route 7, which I'm sure you know, which
Mhm. Of
comes through the
course.
towns and it gets backed up and everyone complains about the traffic and how it's getting worse. And for some reason, some people, when you talk about having trains and talk about people being able to get here more easily, they somehow imagine that's going to add to the traffic. And it's
Right.
just, I think it's a lot of this has to do with painting the picture. And in fact, as you've said, and the material you've developed about the Maybrook line, the potential of the Maybrook line, is that it's a way to get people out of their cars. So you reduce traffic. You can have more people, you can have more activity, more vibrant communities, but you're not adding cars. This is an alternative And obviously, then you have to do things to increase walkability and to make bikes and to have other kinds,
Well,
light
yeah.
transport services. But those things are all possible. Um,
I think it's because I think a lot of people, I think we're all uh, so many people in America, we just think more people, more cars, and
yeah,
until you realize that, well, it's like, well, if you want fewer cars, you should make it easier for people to not use
right.
cars. And it's like there's like a cognitive dissonance. People's wires get crossed and they don't really get it. But what I and that's why, like, I was talking about this with my sister, and she lives in Austin, and we chatted with
Yeah.
Ellis a couple
Uh-huh.
weeks ago from Ellis on the Rails. He wrote a piece about the Austin
Oh,
light
yeah.
rail that they're
Yeah.
working on. And I shared it with my
Mhm.
sister, and she just had a couple thoughts about it. We were just chatting, and we were talking kind of about that same thing where Austin's been
Mhm.
growing like crazy, and they've been really trying to have to update their infrastructure to meet this huge new population of people that live there. And for a lot of people, they're like, "Well, traffic's bad. We'll just make the highways bigger. Just add another lane." And there's this sort of disconnect where it's like, yes, well, traffic will just get bad
Yeah.
again. You can add more lanes. She was telling me about how there was a terrible accident recently. Some people were injured and even killed on the big
Uh-huh.
highway that runs through the heart of Austin that everybody uses to get around. And I hope people can kind of think to themselves, like, not only does expanding rail or bikeability or walkability doesn't add traffic, but that makes things safer. Like,
Mm.
we take transportation for granted when it is very
Yeah.
unsafe
Yeah.
in many ways. It's not just inconvenient, it's not just annoying that you got bumper to bumper traffic, it's also
Yeah, yeah,
very,
Gareth Dennis, the British rail engineer expert that I talked to a couple weeks ago on the podcast, was, that he really emphasizes that the cars are very large, heavy, dangerous things. And
Mhm,
building more highways, it's well documented, very well documented, that expanding highways simply it's not like there needs to be a name like Murphy's Law, that the
mhm.
traffic simply expands to fill it.
Exactly,
This is
demand just meets
Yeah,
capacity and you just get traffic again.
that has happened all over. I remember in London when they built the M25, they thought, "Oh, that's gonna improve things." Before long, everyone's going,
Mhm.
"M25, no!"
Oh my gosh. And what I feel really strongly about, and I see, like, for me, it's enough to, like, send me into, like, apoplexy when, like, I read about people saying, like, well, let's add another lane on this highway in Connecticut, or, it would break my heart if some of these communities in the Berkshires, like,
Mhm,
or in Canaan, were to say Route 7, it's always backed up. Let's just add another lane. And it's like, no, please, like, I'm begging you, like,
right.
you can make a train, and you're gonna ease some of the traffic, and it's gonna be safer, and you're gonna make more money.
This
Please
this
don't ruin
brings
the
us to
community.
a very important misconception. People have an idea that they hear a number attached to the building of rail, and they don't think that there are numbers attached to the building of roads. Building roads is really expensive, and especially
Of course.
expanding roads because the issue of right of way. The kind of work that needs to be done on some of these lines. Now, there are different things. If you put in a brand new high speed rail line where there has been no rail line, that's another ball game. You've got to acquire land. But on the routes where freight trains now run, where there are tracks, where there is right of way, and often enough to double track, or at least to put extra sidings in, which means you can have more, it's much easier to have more frequent trains. That can Putting those costs side by side, there is no chance that the train is not going to come out as the most efficient, economical option. Um,
Mm,
for sure. And that needs to be emphasized. And maybe that's one of the things that we need to talk more about, that
mhm.
that you need to, because you need to see these comparatively. Someone sees, I don't know, $20 million for something, and they think, I mean, $20 million is a lot of money. But
I mean, I
right.
could use $20 million.
But compared to if you, set a whole, row of infrastructure projects, A lot of them, I keep reading about studies, just studies, reports to be, $4 million for this. There was $7 million for that. $3 million spent studying the 15-mile stretch of the Maybrook line between Danbury and Southeast. $3 million. And then on study recently in the last few years. And that study is now sitting on a shelf because after the study was done, they apparently, at that point, they asked the MTA if they would be interested in doing it. And the MTA said, no, that's not on our list of priorities. Seems to me you should have found that out before you spent $3 million.
And and that actually leads me to another question. Like, what was the process like to get the acquisition for Massachusetts to go behind you and say like, yeah, we're going to do this. We're going to commit the money. We're not just going to commit, and like governments do this all the time. They commit to studying something and then, they can just say, well, we studied it. That's a couple million down the drain, but we're not going to go for it. How did that happen that Massachusetts really kind of put its money
Well,
where its mouth
it's an
was?
interesting thing because it really was the leadership of Deval Patrick. Now, the
Really?
Housatonic Railroad commissioned a study, but it wasn't a detailed study of what the upgrade would be required. What kind of upgrade would be required? Because in fact, the rail engineers knew there was no secret sauce. There was nothing very. They knew. Well, you need more ties. You need new modern rail. And then if you're putting those in, you need more ballast, and you're going to need to improve the bridges. None of this is secret stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The,
It's not some
no,
esoteric
no.
knowledge.
And I'm personally dubious about studies, especially when it's something that has been done elsewhere. This is a known kind of work. That there are models for, in this case, there's a model in Massachusetts for what needs to be done in Connecticut. But there was no study, in one of these expensive studies to figure out how to upgrade it. What there was a study, and it was a $250,000, a very modest amount actually for any kind of DOT study,
Yeah.
to study where the stations should be located in the towns in Berkshire County, because they had to look at wetlands and they had to think about the transit-oriented development, what the benefits, social and economic benefits would be of locating the stations and, just kind of the layout. And they recommended that the stations would be Great Barrington Lee and Pittsfield to start rather than Stockbridge and Lenox, because Lenox and Lee are quite close to each other. Stockbridge would, you could add these on, but every time you put in a stop, it slows the trip down by at least 5 minutes. So you could add those.
Mhm.
And then the debate was between Sheffield and Canaan. Now I'm very much in favor of Canaan. And you have to think about where you're going to leave your equipment at night, that kind of stuff, where you have a yard. But none of that requires complicated studies by consultants. The train engineers actually, there are people, we had, these wonderful crews here fixing up this line. But it was Deval Patrick's leadership, because he signed the contract. He got his Department of Transportation to purchase the line for $13 million, and then did a deal, which probably took some negotiation with the railroad, to upgrade the line to the benefit of the private railroad company, but also to specify that the aim was to have passenger service, and that passenger service would get priority, that they, had a right to run passenger trains on that line. So, I mean, these things are really important because otherwise people start, on lines where where there's a private company or one of the major companies like CSX. You have to, if they own the line, that's one thing. If they have legal dispatching rights, that's another thing. So there's complications, but nothing that's unusual. It's all
Right.
normal
I mean,
business.
you ask a professional what to do, and they'll be very. I mean, this is and part of why, I think trains are so interesting, and especially the Berkshire line and the Maybrook line. It's like this does not require new investments in research and development. This is technology that is over 2
Yeah.
centuries old. We know what works functionally.
And the
So, I mean, it sounds like Deval Patrick really showed a
He
lot of
showed
leadership and a lot of
enormous
confidence.
leadership. He could see that he had the vision, and this does require, to be able to imagine
Mhm,
a world that's a little bit different and better than what we have now.
mhm. Which, not to interrupt, but I was thinking I read this piece a couple days ago. It was some commencement speech, and I forget who said it or what, but there was a metaphor in it that I think really ties well to how I think when they hear trains or
Uh-huh,
transit-oriented development or,
uh-huh.
walkability, mixed-use development, and they start to be like, "I don't know, I don't trust all that. I like my car." The story is like 2 fish are swimming along, and they pass by an older fish, and the older fish says, "Hey, good morning, boys. How's the water today?" And then the 2 younger fish keep swimming on, and finally one of them turns and says, "What the hell is water?" And I think and I think that frightens how I think a lot of that's how people, and myself included for a long time, see the world in which we live, and we just think, "Well, of course I drive everywhere. Well, of course, if I'm baking a cake and I forgot I need eggs, I have to make it a 20-minute odyssey to a giant
Yeah,
supermarket. I can't just walk around the corner to a corner store that existed in the 1950s, but for some reason doesn't anymore." So I think we all take for granted the way we live our lives in a way that we shouldn't.
yeah,
And it sounds like Deval Patrick was able to see the
yeah.
water and be like, well, maybe the water could be
That's
different. I
right.
don't know.
And, you know, the advantage we have in some of the towns, I was struck by the photos that you sent of the areas around the tracks in some of the towns on the Maybrook line, is that the potential for developing new things, appropriate new things, is really, really great. Because when you take a suburb where everyone's used to driving a car, I think that remodeling those is really difficult because the US has been, a lot of the US, most of the US has been designed for cars. I think we're actually fortunate here in the East. It's a little easier for us because the trains were there. But those small towns, the one thing I really wanted to mention, because this comes up in northwestern Connecticut and maybe would come up in those towns along the Maybrook line, is that when it comes to visualizing what train service would be like, I think that people think about huge Amtrak trains thundering through their towns.
They met
Yeah,
rattling and
yeah.
loud. Like that scene from the Blues Brothers
Oh,
where there's a train going by every minute in Elwood's apartment.
I'll have to check
I don't know,
that out. So I think, and yeah, the thunkety thunk and shaking and rattling and these,
rattling. Yeah.
huge machines where on lines like these, that is not what we need or want. That there are very small, compact, lightweight trains, especially more modern
Right.
electric trains. But even
Course.
the older single, I've forgotten what they're called, and so they're not great long, you know. It might be a
Yeah.
single carriage to start. You don't know, like the ones I was talking about in England. It's train
Mhm.
service can be very flexible, can be on a single track because you have sidings, and with computerized systems, you can have, good, safe dispatching and coordination. And so and if we had service up here, what we talked about with the study for the Housatonic line was simply to have eight trains each way a day,
Mhm.
and not super frequent. You could build from there. This is not a heavy duty thing that's going to change the sort of character of towns. In fact, especially towns that are kind of old fashioned and you come for tranquil, weekends and summer breaks.
You come like, I mean, not to interrupt, but I feel like when I was going through and scoping out some of the ones like Kent and Canaan and New Milford, it's like if you had train service, you would be
Yeah.
restoring this like golden age of American transportation, commerce, travel. And you can see that these communities were designed for rail
Yeah.
transportation. It's just that it just
Yeah.
dried up, you know,
You can
around.
easily, I mean, look at, yeah, I mean, how wonderful it would be.
Like, clearly, it was like this in the past, and it like, it could very easily come
Yeah,
again,
it's a
you
fit.
know?
It's a really nice fit. And
It's not about grafting something that doesn't belong on, it's more like
yeah,
reopening.
yeah. So I think on that
Yeah.
note, we will do this again, and we can dive into some of the specific issues. I think it would be really good to look at the idea of the development that can take place around stations,
Yes.
because you've been
Mhm.
thinking about that, and some of the zoning issues. We can talk about zoning. I'm working on a book about third places, and I'm writing a lot about zoning. Zoning turns out to be
Mhm.
in the U.S. very interesting, very problematic.
It's definitely it's the water.
It's the
It's the water
water.
we don't know
And
is there.
but my
You
co-author, Ray Oldenburg, I said to him once before he died, I said, I'm gonna have to write about zoning in this new book. He said, "You're gon Nobody's gonna wanna read about zoning." He felt strongly about it, but he couldn't imagine how I could make it interesting. So I think about Ray now whenever zoning comes up, because I think, gotta make people realize how interesting zoning is. So I'm glad to have a chance to talk to you about it.
Of course, yeah, no, I'm happy to, and yeah, it's just like I said, like my father explaining to me 15 years ago how important it was. It took me this long to figure it out, but you can make it
Yes,
interesting.
and
Hopefully,
yeah.
we can make it happen in, maybe one pot
Great,
45 minutes rather than
great.
15 years.
Okay, terrific. Thanks so much. We'll talk again
Alright.
soon. Take care.
Thanks a lot, Karen. Yeah, talk soon. Be well.
Thanks for joining me at Train Time. Don't forget to subscribe. Send me your suggestions for future shows. And visit our YouTube channel, Train Campaign, for some great interviews and amazing historical footage, including a bit from the documentary The Last Train to Pittsfield, filmed in 1971.